All right, so I'm doing something a little bit different today. We're going to try a reaction video to philosophy. 'Cause, yeah, don't fucking give a fuck. But anyway, so I've been checking out this Quine over here discussion, and I've seen parts of it before. Like I've seen the Ned Block panel, but I've never watched the Dennett one. So I figured I'd go ahead and watch it and try something maybe a little bit weird, do a reaction. See if this works. Do this fucking...
Our guest panelist in this program is Daniel Dennett, Distinguished Art and Science Professor and Director of the Center for Cognitive Studies at Tufts University. Although his areas of specialization are cognitive science, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of psychology, he has published extensively on most philosophical topics. Professor Dennett has also brought his work to a wider public audience, most notably with the mind.
What year was this recorded? What did it say? It said 96? So I remember Quine dying. I remember he died like in 2000. Is that right? Yeah, because I was in grad school still. I remember, I think I just started grad school actually. And I saw a thing on the board that said Quine had died. I knew of him. I didn't realize how famous he was at that time. So this was 96. So this just before he died, I guess. Okay.
I, co-authored with Douglas Hofstadter, and his recent best-selling Consciousness Explained. The main objective in this panel discussion is to provide an overview of Professor Quine's major philosophical doctrines and to invite his comments on how he views these doctrines now. Very broadly, the areas we'll consider include his early association with logical positivism, his notorious skepticism about meaning, his stance on epistemology and ontology, and his characterization of philosophy as a part of or continuous with science.
Cool. Yeah.
Finally, we discuss Quine's opinions of philosophy today and ask which problems he would choose to work on now if he were just beginning his philosophical career. We now join the panel on location in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
All right, so before we start, I do wonder how familiar people are with Quine. I mean, I certainly didn't study him until grad school, but I wonder if the people watching this video, obviously you must be watching a video on Quine. You probably know he is. Man, I suck. Anyway, I'm curious, let me know.
Professor Quine, in our interview, we touched on a number of your philosophical doctrines and philosophical themes, which I'd like to pursue now in greater detail. To help us to do this, we're joined now by Daniel Dennett, Professor of Philosophy at Tufts University, Paul Horwich, Professor of Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Martin Davies, who's Wild Reader of Mental Philosophy at Oxford University. Paul.
Just as a curious side note here, you know, two of those guys I've had classes with. So Martin Davies taught at the Graduate Center, and I took a class with philosophy of cognitive science with him. And one of my papers actually came out of that seminar, What is a Brain State? And then Paul Horwich was at the Grad Center too, and I took a couple classes with him on deflationism and expressivism and stuff like that. So, and I actually just, anyway, no one cares. But yeah, so it's interesting to see these guys way back when, because I was taking those classes in the early 2000s. So I guess that wasn't way back when. This would have just been a few years before that, right? Oh my God. Just the video makes it seem like so old. This feels like it's from the 70s. The video production is fucking crazy.
Could you start us off?
Yes, Professor Quine. I'd like to ask you about your sense of the philosophical scene at the beginning of your career, as you found it then. A common assumption about philosophy throughout its history is that it concerns a especially profound and important realm of facts of its own, having to do with the ultimate nature of reality and how we ought to lead our lives. These facts, it's often assumed, are completely distinct from scientific facts and are to be investigated by methods peculiar to philosophy.
By the way, Paul is Horwich is still he's at NYU now. He gave a lecture just recently on something to do with Kripke's paradox about meaning and Wittgenstein. So he's still trucking along, very gray now. So he looks young here actually. So this is a while ago. 96. So that was about 10 years before I had a class with him. Man, yeah, I know. Look at me 10 years ago, dude. Like,
involving pure reason, speculative insight. But at the beginning of this century, the beginning of the 20th century, a movement was established known as positivism or logical empiricism that put into question this conception of philosophy. The positivists, such people as the young Ludwig Wittgenstein and Rudolf Carnap, held that what they called speculative metaphysics could give us nothing more than empty words, disguised nonsense, and that it should be done away with. Did you find yourself in sympathy with this critique of traditional philosophy?
okay, can we all guess what Quine's answer is going to be here? I guess this is supposed to be like a video for people that don't know about his views already. It's kind of an introduction to his views. But yeah, all right. So it's interesting to note, too, that in philosophy, speculative metaphysics have really come back. And even in Quine's own, he's had a large hand in voicing the skepticism about speculative metaphysics, emphasizing the continuity of philosophy and science. But since Kripke and others, this work is just rampant. So it is interesting to think sort of about what's happened to philosophy in the last 20 years or so. Yeah, interesting. All right, let's continue. How can I have a reaction video to philosophy? I'm just going to be sitting here thinking, oh, yeah. Oh, man. All right. Continuing to impress myself. Let's go.
I'm very much in sympathy with their attitude towards a good deal of speculative metaphysics. Where I would take issue is over the notion of there being a sharp boundary between that on the one hand and responsible science, natural science, on the other. I think
right, that's an important point, because the basic idea there is that the traditional view, especially from the positivists, was that there were sentences which were kind of true analytically. They were true by definition, like all bachelors are married. I really do suck at this. All bachelors are unmarried. It's true by definition. And then there were sentences that you had to learn about from experience, like all bachelors are bad cooks or something like that, which you could have to confirm empirically by either meeting bachelors and finding out that they're good or bad at it. But the other one didn't seem to be that way. And the logical positivists seemed to think that there was this sharp cut between the one kind of sentences, which were sort of true by definition, analytically true, or whatever you want to call it, and then the other kinds of sentences, which were empirically confirmed. And so that's what he's talking about there, and what he's suggesting is that he was skeptical that there was any such division, as he's famous for arguing.
rather as a matter of degree.
All right, so let's go back a little bit, since I flapped a little bit too much right there.
The more speculative and general the problem or the doctrines are, perhaps the more philosophical. And you do, proceeding in that direction, reach a level of speculative metaphysics. Where I would take issue is over the notion of there being a sharp boundary between that on the one hand and responsible science, natural science, on the other. I think of it rather as a matter of degree. The more speculative and general the problem or the doctrines are, perhaps the the more the more philosophical, and you do proceeding in that direction reach a level finally where you can't make proper responsible sense of the doctrines at all, and there you're in the realm where I very much sympathize with the logical positivists or empiricists in rejecting it as meaningless. As for
like Dennett's beard is really under control right there. It's longer nowadays. Okay, but so what is he saying right there? So he's saying that he sympathizes with the logical positivists to the extent that some kinds of very speculative metaphysical claims are meaningless, but he doesn't agree that there's a very sharp boundary between the things which are speculative and the things which are empirically confirmed. So he's trying to agree but also disagree. So let's go back because I got distracted by the beard.
questions of how one should live one's life, this sort of philosophy, if philosophy it be, is so very remote from science and from the kind of speculative philosophy that I find continuous with science, that I wouldn't know where to put it. It's a sort of, well, it's perhaps somewhat on a par with engineering. Perhaps it's human engineering, in which one would draw on scientific findings insofar as they were relevant, including findings perhaps in psychology. And it's only an accidental matter of traditional usage, perhaps, to call it philosophical.
To go back to the first...
Wait a minute, hold on. Did I miss something? I think, hold on, let me go back.
Sort of philosophy, if philosophy it be, is so very remote from...
If philosophy it be, what the... Okay, hold on. Let me... What is he saying there? Is he saying what I think he's saying? Is he saying moral philosophy isn't really philosophy? It's more like engineering, which is a practical thing, right? That's it's how to build something, how to do something. Is he making the kind of Aristotelian distinction there between like theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge? Or is he doing something else? I didn't know that was part of his view. But why call it just because it's practical? Why I think it's not philosophy? If philosophy it be, what kind of statement is that? I guess. Anyway, let me re-listen. Maybe I'm misinterpreting what he's saying right here. Okay.
Where I would take issue with
back at the beginning. Yeah, let's listen to the whole thing. I'm not going to listen to the question over again because I might have to speed it up actually because it's kind of hard to listen to this. 1.25, that should do it, right?
An important realm of facts of its own, having to do with the ultimate nature of reality and how we ought to lead our lives. These facts, it's often assumed, are completely distinct from scientific facts and are to be investigated by methods peculiar to philosophy involving pure reason, speculative insight. But at the beginning of this century, the beginning of the 20th century, a movement was established known as positivism or logical empiricism that put into question this conception of philosophy. The positivists, such people as the young Ludwig Wittgenstein and Rudolf...
I guess I should have mentioned that the first time I was stopping here because, yeah, the idea was that there was this sharp distinction between sentences on the one hand, which can be empirically confirmed, and those which were true by definition, but sort of the ultimate, taking Hume to his logical conclusion, those guys thought the ones that were true by definition didn't tell you anything meaningful about the world. So that was in contradistinction to this older philosophical tradition that said that reason could tell you something about the nature of reality. So that was an important point that Paul was making right there, Horch is making, which I didn't pick up on before.
Quine held that what they called speculative metaphysics could give us nothing more than empty words, disguised nonsense, and that it should be done away with. Did you find yourself in sympathy with this critique of traditional philosophy?
I'm very much in sympathy with their attitude towards a good deal of speculative metaphysics. Where I would take issue is...
Yeah, he's sympathetic to their attitude towards a good deal of speculative metaphysics. Okay. So I guess some speculative metaphysics on his view is going to be just really theoretical science. Like if you take science far enough out, like for instance, in my work, I think about consciousness and neuroscience a lot. And if you take neuroscience like to its theoretical limit, so to speak, I think you end up doing the kind of philosophy of mind stuff that I tend to do. So, and that also sounds like speculative metaphysics because you're saying, talking about identity theory and representations in the brain and so forth. So I think that might be what the kind of view he's talking about here. This is interesting. All right, this is fun. So, and I hopefully going to learn something from you guys telling me things about this as well in the comments. This video, how long is it? Holy shit, 2 hours? All right, so maybe we'll just do a part of this. And if people like this, maybe I'll do this as a series, but I don't know. People may think this is a dumb idea. So we'll see. All right, let's at least get through a couple of his answers here.
Where the notion of there being a sharp boundary between that on the one hand and responsible science, natural science, on the other. I think of it rather as a matter of degree. The more speculative and general the problem or the doctrines are, perhaps the more philosophical.
Okay.
And you do, proceeding in that direction, reach a level finally where you can't make proper, responsible sense of the doctrines at all, and there you're in the realm where I very much sympathize with the logical positivists or empiricists in rejecting it as meaningless. As for questions of how one should live one's life, this sort of philosophy, if philosophy it be, is so very remote from science and from the kind of speculative philosophy that I find continuous with science, that I wouldn't know where to put it. It's a sort of, well, it's perhaps somewhat on a par with engineering. Perhaps it's human engineering, in which one would draw on scientific findings insofar as they were relevant, including findings perhaps in psychology. And it's only a accidental matter of traditional usage, perhaps, to call it philosophical.
And to go back to the...
So that's interesting. So it does sound like what he's saying is he doesn't think, I guess, what would he be saying there? I guess what he's saying is that it's normative ethics, which he doesn't see as part of philosophy. But meta-ethics certainly has got to be... I didn't realize he had that view. That's interesting. How to live one's life, questions about what way to live one's life, what counts as good, what's right. Those questions are more like human engineering. So you appeal to some science, so you find out what's good for human beings, and you say live like that. Interesting. Okay. So yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about that one. Certainly meta-ethics has got to be philosophy, the meaning of moral terms, whether they can be justified or whether relativism is true, emotivism, those kinds of questions sound like philosophical questions. Yeah, to be honest, I'm not too comfortable with boundary policing and saying this is philosophy or that's not philosophy. But I guess I sort of take the point that he's making. If you think of philosophy as asking very abstract theoretical questions, then the kind of thing he's envisioning, how do you live your life, that's not an abstract theoretical question, that's a very lived practical question. So maybe that's just the point that he's making, but certainly I would think there are philosophical questions there. What do you guys think? Yeah, all right, so let's hear what Paul's response to this is. This is interesting.
First part of your answer to my question. The positivists thought that it was essential to get a strict separation between speculative metaphysics that they deplored and science that they liked. In saying, as you just did, that in your view there isn't a strict separation between metaphysics and science, aren't you departing in a fairly substantial way from the central tenet of...
Well, I'm certainly...
Yeah, he's definitely answered that's got to be yes. I think he said that. He said where he would depart from them is that he doesn't think there's a strict separation, but where he agrees with them is that he thinks. So the way I'm picturing what Quine is saying here is that if you think about like neuroscience, like I was saying a second ago, or physics or whatever, like physics is a good example too. When you get to the boundaries of it, you're basically doing philosophy. Like think about string theory. At that point, you're basically asking questions, doing philosophy of science. You're asking, what reason do we have to accept this theory, etc. And that's indistinguishable from doing philosophy. Now, scientists are doing that, physicists are doing it, philosophers are doing it. They intermingle, and they basically have the same set of tools, and they basically are asking the same question with different histories. So that's a kind of speculative metaphysics that's connected to science, as I'm understanding it, the point. But then there are other kind of speculative metaphysical claims, like that maybe panpsychism counts as an example of this. I don't know, that are like outside, that are disconnected from science, that are outside the realm of science, that are purely philosophical in a pejorative sense, the way these older generations of philosophers would use that term, purely speculative. And so those, I think, Quine's going to say, are meaningless. Like I think he thinks like thought experiments about zombies and inverts and stuff. Those are, I saw the Block discussion where he basically says those are meaningless. They don't have any meaning. That they seem like they do, but they don't. So I think that's what he's going to say. But anyway, so that's my take to Paul's. That's my response to Paul. Okay, yeah, good, it's fine. Made it through 6 minutes of a 2-hour video. How long is this? What the hell?
Departing from them on that point. And
oh, yeah, he says yes, he's departing, right? Is that what just happened? Did he just agree with me? Let me check it out here.
Separation between metaphysics and science, aren't you departing in a fairly substantial way from the central tenet of...
Well, I'm certainly departing from them on that point. And, well, pretty substantial, I should think.
Yeah, totally. Okay, good.
But that's not the only point at which you depart. You dedicated Word and Object in 1960 to Rudolf Carnap, teacher and friend, and the book begins, the first chapter, with just a clarion call to a different view of where we start in philosophy, to what Carnap had always proposed. And I'm wondering, were you able to persuade him that you were right in any of this? Which features of your vision, 25 years after, 30 years after you became a student, which features of your vision were you able to persuade him of, if any?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, I mean, if you guys don't know the history about Carnap and Quine, which I only know part of it, but I do know that Quine was a student of Carnap or something like that, and that they were very close. And Quine disagreed with a lot of what Carnap had said, but he really understood his views because he had worked very closely with them. So he had worked his way into that point of view enough to be able to really say where he disagreed with it, and really critiqued it in a serious way, obviously. But yeah, it's to be interesting to see if he ever convinced Carnap that he was right about any of these things. I'm trying to think, as far as I know, maybe some about internal, external questions. Well, let's find out. Yeah, let's hear the answer. That's a good question.
Back there in the period when I was, 1933 it was, when I was discussing so intensively with Carnap in Prague for some couple of months. At that time, he was between two books, his Logischer Aufbau der Welt, which was decidedly
the logical structure of the world, right? That's what that is, I think. Is that book? I don't know German.
based on a phenomenalistic approach, and Carnap had already departed from that orientation himself, and had just been writing, had just perhaps finished writing his logical syntax of language, which his wife was typing, and I was reading sheaf by sheaf as it came out of her typewriter. Certainly.
Wait, did he say his wife was typing it? Jeez, holy moly.
More matters of well, largely matters of detail, but also, again,
Wait, what happened?
More matters of my own attitude in word and object was decidedly remote from the Aufbau, but I felt not as remote from his current view.
Okay, hold on. I messed something up. Jiminy criminy. Let me.
Based on a phenomenalistic approach, and Carnap had already departed from that orientation himself.
Okay, here we
and
are.
was and
Why am I so bad at just rewinding these videos? Like, this is terrible. I'm terrible at this. What the fuck? All right, but anyway, logical syntax, yes, okay.
had just been writing, had just perhaps finished writing his logical syntax of language, which his wife was typing, and I was reading sheaf by sheaf as it came out of her typewriter. Certainly, my own attitude in word and object was decidedly remote from the Aufbau, but I felt not as remote from his current view at in the logical syntax.
Yeah.
And my departures from his attitude in that book were more matters of well, largely matters of detail, but also, again, as in the case of the condemnation of metaphysics, question of my disavowing a demarcation in favor of gradations. And I felt early and late that my departures from Carnap's views as of logical syntax, from which incidentally he also departed very decidedly in the next few years, in another direction from mine. But I felt that my departure from that intermediate stand in Carnap's development was a departure in the sense in which science progresses, not throwing over the old science as somehow having been wrong direction, but further improvements in the same general spirit. And I felt I was sharing Carnap's general spirit, the rigorous approach to philosophical questions, and liberal use of the techniques of mathematical logic. And that stays, and that to this day I think is a tremendous contribution on the part of, well, the Untitled Circle, but more particularly Carnap.
Probably your most famous and influential piece of work is the article Two Dogmas of Empiricism, published in 1951.
Oh shit, we're gonna get into some meaning here. Do I got time to do this? Let me check what time it is right now. Okay. Let's do it. Wait. Yeah. Okay. Let's do it. Oh my goodness.
Could you say what the main theses are of this paper and why you think it was found to be so revolutionary?
Yes. When I gave that lecture, which a month later appeared as a paper in the Philosophical Review, I had no concern.
By the way, in case you don't know, the Philosophical Review is like one of the top journals in the philosophy world. Philosophical Review, Journal of Philosophy, philosophy and phenomenological research. Those are the top three, but I think philosophical review is like the top of those top three. That's Noose is up there too. I don't know. Anyway, so those are the top journals, but old school, yeah, cool.
That it was going to be such a that it was going to bring such a widespread and voluminous response.
Mm-hmm.
I had written it and prepared my lecture only on request. It was an assignment. I had, how many years earlier? About 1940, so 10, 11 years earlier, had come quite definitely to the conclusion that Carnap's dichotomy between empirical knowledge and what he called analytic truth, which was just a matter of verbal conventions, that this was itself an unempirical and ill-defined or undefined dichotomy, and that the contribution of convention, unconscious convention, incidentally, which had seemed to me rather a contradiction in terms, between what you might put down to the meanings of the words, what's true by virtue of the meanings of the words in the sentence, and on the other hand, what's true in view of scientific discoveries, empirical discoveries, was a misconception, and that there's, in general, a contribution from both sides in just about everything we say. Finally get down to pure logic, and then you've got something which surely is acquired through learning the logical words, the grammatical particles, and, or, and, etc., which are governed by laws of logical inference.
The title of the paper refers to two dogmas of empiricism, and presumably one of them is the point you just, the assumption that there is a strict distinction between what is known on the basis of experience, or what is true in virtue of the empirical facts.
Yeah, this, by the way, is something that's really hard to take. I mean, it's amazing it came up with this idea, but so the idea is that, you know, there's no line you can draw where you could put all the sentences on one side that are just true by convention, by the meaning of words, and on the other hand, true simply by what you would find out about the world scientifically. So that's a bit shocking, you might say. It seems like obviously, like, you know, bachelors being unmarried or things of that nature certainly don't seem to have depend in any way on the world. But that's the kind of point that he's gonna make here, is that they do and seem to. This is an attack on the analytic synthetic distinction. But the second dogma, yeah, what is it? So the first is that there's this hard distinction, and then the second is
what
what's
is
about
true
meaning.
simply as a matter of definition or convention. What is the other dogma? What is the relationship between the two dogmas?
The other dogma, the notion that
He's trying to remember. He's like, well, yeah, what was that other dogma? What was that, 50 years ago I wrote that?
our knowledge was in that paper. It came in as a speculatively as one possible reason for people being so convinced convinced of the dichotomy between analytic and synthetic statements. I've been groping for a reason why that seems so fundamental. Yes, reductionism was the word I used, and that all our empirical concepts about the nature of physical objects and the rest, could be reduced by definition, or at least linguistic convention, somewhat short of definition, to sensory input. And what I was pushing instead is a holism, the sort of thing that had been urged a couple of decades before by Pierre Duhem, according to which such reduction is not to be hoped for.
Your idea was that once reductionism has been done away with and replaced with holism, then there isn't the need, that positivist thought, to draw a distinction between analytic and synthetic truths.
So just before they get to that, so he's using the word reductionism there in a non-standard, I would say, way nowadays, because reductionism is like typically thought to be either a relation that holds between theories, like you could reduce a theory to another theory, or between things, like you reduce water to H2O or something like that. But here what he means is what sometimes people might nowadays call atomism, or something like that. That so you take like the sentence, that dog is brown, or the dog is brown, or something. Suppose you're looking over at a dog, there's a dog over there, and you say that dog is brown. And so there's the animal over there, and there's your statement about it, there's your thought about it, and we're trying to figure out what's going on here. And so there's a picture that you might think that, look, that the meaning of the word brown traces back to your sensory experience of the color of the dog and what it has in common with other brown things. You might think the meaning of the word dog traces back to your experience with the animals, and learning to what animals fall on that set and so forth. And so when you say that dog is brown, that kind of, there's a kind of experience that you could pick out and say, aha, this utterance here kind of, well, in his terms, reduces to, in a sense, can be traced back to in terms of its what makes it true or verifies it or something like that, in terms of this one particular experience. And what he's arguing here is that no, all of everything, the holism bit, faces experience all together. So you can't just isolate out one sentence and say, well, this thing, and hold it up against experience. It's all of our theories that this is his famous web of belief, that there is this web where the boundary conditions are experience. So that's where the web meets the world, is that experience. And then logic and math would be sort of in the center of the web. Then everything else is linked in a certain way. So now let's get back to Horwich's question here.
Truths of fact and truths of meaning.
So, right, what was his question? Just remind yourself. He was saying, what's your basic idea once that you accept holism, that you can't make this distinction? And so what do we think Quine's going to say? If everything is interconnected and you can't single one thing out and hold it up, then you can't say, well, this thing can be only known by experience and this thing can be known by definitions, because everything is sort of connected by definition and meets experience around the edges. So I think that is Paul's Horwich's question about, is your point here that once you accept holism, then meaning holism, then or confirmation holism, or both? Which one is he talking about here? I guess he hasn't made it clear. Let me shut up and let's listen to Quine.
That was part of the argument. More of the argument against analyticity consisted in my trotting out some of the familiar characterizations, true by virtue of the meanings of the words. There's one characterization, one definition. A vaguer one, true by necessity. True by virtue of definitions. And I argued that these were not helpful because they were subject to the same doubts as the notion of analyticity itself. And so having dismissed those, and then also having dismissed this, as I suppose, further likely source of the first dogma, namely the dogma of reductionism, that combination was my argument. But as I think back on it, I wasn't persuaded even then that I had disproved the possibility of a satisfactory notion of analyticity. I was questioning what is it, and maintaining that we had never been told.
I see. So, that's interesting. So he, in his mind, he's saying he wasn't trying to argue against it, but simply saying, look, if we want to understand it, we need to know what it is. No one's ever said what it is in a satisfactory way. Hence, you get that thing that he was just talking about, what sometimes people call the semantic circle. You say, well, what's analyticity? Well, it's being, true by definition. Say, well, what's true by definition? Well, it's having same meaning. Well, what's sameness of meaning? And so you just kind of go around and around until you end up back at analyticity again. So it sounds like what he was saying is it's not so much that he wanted to prove it false, but he wants to say you can't define it. You can't even say what it means to be analytic in a satisfactory way. Yeah, that's interesting. But he was sort of saying that he wasn't seeing what Paul was saying, which was that he didn't really see this holism bit as playing a role until later. So the first thing was like, well, we don't even really know what analyticity is. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so that's the first step, is how do you define it? To me, I've never really been convinced that you can't define it in terms of sameness of meaning. I mean, I know Quine's arguments here about meaning, but yeah, interesting. All right, well, let's continue.
This skepticism about the notion of analyticity, about the idea that some sentences are true solely in virtue of what they mean, extends to a more general skepticism about the notion of meaning and concepts related to the notion of meaning, such as definition, the idea of one word being synonymous with another word. Was your position then that it's simply an illusion that words have meanings and that sometimes two words have the same meaning?
Yeah, is it an illusion? No, I think he's going to say that in the common sense way that we talk ordinarily, words do have meanings, but it's more in this like philosophical sense that he's questioning. So let's see. Hold on. Yeah, that's a good question.
So how do you reconcile this fairly extreme skepticism with your own evident fascination with language and with the meanings of words?
Good, yes. I wouldn't have said that words don't have meanings, but rather, or that words always have different meanings or never have the same meanings. Rather, I would say that I can't make adequate sense even of those sentences because I'm challenging the notion of meaning. Yes, I think even back at that time, I was seeing this problem of meaning as the same as the problem of analyticity, because one of the ways of defining analyticity was that an analytic sentence was equivalent to or had the same meaning as a tautology, 0 equals 0. You could define, there's one of the ways of defining one of these concepts in terms of another, in this case, sameness of meaning. What was worrying me, early and late, especially later, getting on towards word and object, was the notion of sameness of meaning. And that's what I was challenging.
Right.
And I argued that to challenge the notion of sameness of meaning is to challenge the notion of meaning. That is to say, the notion of the meaning of an expression. Because there's no entity without identity. You haven't you've made sense of some alleged object or category of objects, except insofar as you've explained it's a criterion for deciding when you have two of them and when just one. When are they the same? When are they different?
Yeah, that's a good point right there. And if you want to say there's something, you need to know when there's one, when there's two, how many of them, how to individuate them, how to distinguish them. So if you want to know what meanings are, I think what he's saying right here. So if you want to know what meanings are, then you mean to be able to say when there's more than one or when there is the same one. So that's why sameness of meaning is coming into play here, because if you can't say that these two expressions have the same meaning, then that's in a sense to say that you can't say what the meaning of the expressions are, because if you knew the meaning of the expression, then you should be able to say whether they're the same or not, because that's knowing the meaning is being able to say whether you have this one or a different one or more 14 of this one kind or 6 of the other kind, or whether it's the same as that one over there or not. So that's a good point he's making by focusing on the attack on the sameness of meaning. Do these two expressions have the same meaning, and showing that that doesn't really work, at least in his view. Then that's attacking the notion of meanings in general. I mean, we all know this line, right? Meanings are creatures of darkness. So that's interesting. I mean, I think you can respond to that, but I want to, yeah, so this is only 20 minutes into a 2-hour video. Let me at least make it through Horwich's question, and then maybe I'll come back and do questions section by section. So maybe I'll do Horwich and then Dennett and then Davies, if people care. Maybe no one wants to watch this stuff with me. Who knows?
I can't say when meanings are the same. You haven't said what meanings are.
Yeah, that's what I was just saying.
Now I'm stressing the plural of meaning, because I'm not and never was rejecting semantics and the semantical side of linguistics. I couldn't bear to. So we are engaged, and semanticists and lexicographers are engaged in the study of meaning and the meaning of language and the meaning of sentences. Here, however, I'm using the word meaning not as a distributive term, but I'm using it as a mass term, like water, like sugar, meaning of language, meaning of things, but not meanings of anything.
When you first began this challenge to the notion of meaning, I think a lot of people just couldn't imagine that you really meant it. We could really get along without this idea of fixed meanings in the head, which gave words their meaning. And then you came up in Word and Object with your famous thought experiment about radical translation, which was, I think, supposed to drive that point home.
Exactly.
And let me just say what that thought experiment is, because there's been a lot of puzzlement and a lot of controversy about how to read it. You imagine a tribe of people living off somewhere where they're completely isolated from the rest of the world, so that there's no knowledge of their language, so there's no bilinguals anywhere. There's no chain of interpreters. And we imagine sending a couple of linguists into the field to learn the language of these people. And they each go about the job independently. And of course, they have to work it out from first principles. They have to. It would be like trying to learn a language on another planet. You would have to work out what words for yes and no were, and it would be an elaborate analytical procedure. And the amazing conclusion you came up with was that in principle, these two linguists could go, and they could both do a wonderful job. They could come back with a dictionary and a grammar so that you could converse with these people, you could learn their language. And yet, if you looked closely at the two dictionaries, at the two versions of this language translated into our language, say, they'd be different. That is to say, they would, not just in trivial details, they would be in substantial ways, they would be different ways of rendering their language in our language. And then the amazing claim you made was, and there wouldn't be any fact of the matter about which one was right. Now, a lot of people, now they knew you were serious about your challenge to meaning, because this was, to them, I think, a sort of outrageous suggestion that there wouldn't be any fact of the matter. And many critics have tried to offer refutations of your radical translation thought experiment. And one of the things they've done is they've challenged you to give an example, even an imaginary example, of what it would be like for this actually to happen. What would happen? What would be the case? Can you respond to the challenge that you give us an example of a real radical translation failure, the indeterminacy of radical translation?
I've never been able to arrive at a satisfactory example of that. Radical translation is a hard job, but the position is plausible, rather, to me, on the basis of consideration of what one has to go on. And what does constitute a test of a faithful manual of translation?
Yeah, that's a good point.
The only test I can see is in principle, smoothness of dialogue,
Right.
success in negotiations when you're using that language. And
So that point's important because what he's saying is, look, so you have this translation book. You're wondering, like, is it a good one or not? Does it capture what they're saying? How are you going to judge that? Well, you're going to judge it by whether you can get along with the other people using this translation manual. Right? So that I think that he's setting this up to be like, this is the only criteria we have to judge the success of these things, or these third personal things. All right, let's see where he's going with this.
so here you would have two manuals which are completely faithful and successful by any such test. And furthermore, we could even say they, by chance, are equally simple.
All right, so I guess what he's saying here, what he's doing here, he's saying, look, I can't think of an example, but conceptually I can make sense of this happening. Is that what he's saying? Not really the question, but
in their translations. And now,
94.
how about the test of their distinctness?
By the way, 94, that was the year I started college. Jesus, okay, fuck.
Similarity, because from any point of view, there are many acceptable ways of translating a sentence from one language to another, simply because of the fact that we have interchangeable sentences in our own language, and either of these would do as a translation of the sentence in question from the alien language.
I mean, that's a good point, right? We have sentences that you could say, he was noble of spirit, he was noble of mind, or something like that, that maybe is interchangeable. I don't know. So you can find sentences that are roughly the same in meaning, and then, so which one you want to pick. So there's common sense examples like that, I think. So I guess he's saying, well, so here's a wedge, right? There's these examples where you're translating from one language to the other, and different sentences from the one language will work as a translation of it. So this is just a more radical version of that. So can't you see a path from here to there? Is that the kind of argument he's making here?
So it isn't that, but rather translations that are
He said it isn't that, but rather
incompatible in some sense. And a test that presents itself is this. You have some text, some long monologue
right, so wait, hold on. So it's not like that because those are compatible. Is that what he's saying? The two different sentences you select are compatible. So these are incompatible in the sense of ascribing different properties or metaphysical interpretations or whatever to what the person is saying. Like the whole, the example of the Gabagai rabbit, detached rabbit part, temporal slice, thingamabob. So one of those says it's a whole object that you're referring to. The other says it's just a temporal slice, like as the spread out object that's, like something like four-dimensionalism or something like that. Not the whole object, but only a temporal part of it that you're referring to. Those are different metaphysical views. They're both compatible with you all getting along. I think that's where he's going to take this.
Native language, and you have these two manuals, and each manual gives a translation which is smooth and successful by the negotiation and fluency tests, and then you try using the manuals in alternation. First sentence from this monologue you translate by the one manual, the next sentence by the other, and you alternate these. And whereas each pure translation by a single manual turned out to be splendid and smooth, this zigzag translation turns out to be incoherent. there's a way of formulating the criterion that doesn't depend on a intuitive notion of equivalence of English translations, which is something I also challenge, of course, when I'm challenging the sameness of meaning.
Interesting. Okay, so here's a way you could test that. You get the two manuals and you translate sentence, one from A, one from B. You see if you get a coherent passage. If it is a coherent passage, they're basically the same. If it isn't, then they have different, they're incompatible, right? They ascribe different metaphysical or different, they ascribe something differently to the situation. Okay, interesting. I mean, that's not a real life example. I guess what they're saying is like, can you give us an example? I mean, because if you're a Quine, I was going to say Quinean, but he is Quine. He's not just a Quinean. He's Quine. So if you're Quine, the meaningfulness of the statement depends on its empirical connection. So this is if he was going to be very worried about how could you empirically test the thing that he's talking about, or not test it, but how could you empirically differentiate or make sense of the claim that he's talking about. And so here's a way of doing that. Here's some empirical thing which would tell you that the two things were incompatible. All right, interesting. Okay, cool.
The radical translation thought experiment was a way of pressing the skepticism about meaning. I wonder if I can just give you two ways of expressing that skepticism and just ask you which would be the more faithful to your intentions. Would it be better to say the notion of meaning's perfectly all right in its own place, it just can't play any role in serious science? Or would it be better to say notions of meaning, translation, synonymy, definition are really fundamentally flawed?
See, so that's a good distinction that Martin is making there, Martin Davies is making, because on the first way, if it's okay in its own place, then what he's saying is like, you know, in our normal, like, what did you mean by that? And what is the meaning of the French word Chavez or whatever? Like the way we normally talk, in other words, average person, or just speaking English and going, or whatever language we're talking, and going about our daily business, maybe that kind of talk is okay to talk about meaning. So that's what I took from him saying in its own place. But maybe so there, but in the sense of doing science, we might want to eliminate it. And so that was I had a discussion on my Consciousness Live podcast with Jennifer Corns, and that was her view about pain. If you guys didn't watch that, maybe you should if you're interested. But she argued that, you know, when people talk about pain, like you and me, and say my foot hurts, that's okay. But when scientists talk about pain and want to study it and so forth, that's not good because it's a meaningless concept for science. So that would be the first thing that Martin was saying. The second thing would just be like, no, we've got to eliminate it altogether. Everywhere it shows up, talk about meaning is bad. Okay. I mean, my intuitions run strong in the other way, so it's interesting to sit here and think about this because, I mean, the argument's challenging, and you got to have a response to it, right? Otherwise, Quine's right. And maybe that's not so bad if he's right. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think that's a good point, and I go with your first there.
Oh, good. Okay, so he would go with the first. That's what I was saying at the beginning of this, wasn't it? Earlier, I forget. This has already gone longer than I thought. It's 26 minutes in the video. How long is this video going to be? All right. I got real stuff to do. What time is it? Okay. Let's just finish it. This is interesting, though. I was planning on watching this anyway, so this is interesting. I would normally put it faster and just watch it straight through, but still it's fun kind of going through it like this.
Lexicographers use the word meaning, not only the meaning in the sense of a mass term, but meaning of this expression, meaning of that. They'll divide a definition down into sense 1, sense 2, sense 3. The reason for doing that is different contexts in which it's used in a somewhat different way, and that's all right. We can explain their use of it, and we can explain all their use without appealing to anything in the way of an idea in the mind that is fixed in its attachment to a particular string of phonemes.
So notice it's clear then that what he's thinking of when he's thinking of a meaning is what he just said, right? That's that there's an idea in the mind which is attached to a fixed string of phonemes. And that really is like the old school empiricist theory of meaning, going back to like Locke and those guys. It's like the word red has its meaning because it's the word, the phonemes, are attached to an idea, aka experience in the mind, which gives the content to the word. So when you go around saying red, it's traced back to that experience that one has had with red objects. And so that's the sense of meaning that he's challenging, is that there's this idea in the mind. And I guess that's supposed to be the distinction between the distributive terms, like the meaning. These things have meanings, and that's what he was just saying. The sentences have meanings, blah, 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 blah. Versus that there is something called meaning, like water or gold. It's a thing. And that's what he's objecting to, I think. All right, hold on. Yeah.
If we take the interpretation as saying that a meaning can't play a serious role in science,
Yes.
is that completely general? For example, would it rule out the possibility of meaning playing a serious role in a science of linguistics or a science of psychology, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question, because you might have thought, look, so maybe the notion of meaning is not going to play, because when Carnap and those guys were talking about this, they're talking about physics, right? They're talking about the language of fundamental physics, like what kind of language is suited to capturing the way fundamental reality is. So maybe you can't do it that, you might say, but what Martin is saying here is maybe, yeah, obviously, linguistics wants to study the meaning, right? So maybe meanings are good for sciences like that.
I think it does. I think. I would be skeptical about the use of the notion of meaning in theoretical linguistics, as distinct from practical lexicography. Theoretical linguistics, or as in psychology, or in psychology, as in philosophy.
I'm struck by the way that if we took this skepticism fully seriously, it would seem to undercut what many people would think of as the philosopher's stock in trade. If you ask a philosopher a question, there are many philosophers whose very first response will be, depends what you mean, or first define your terms. But those notions, meaning and definition, are sub judice, according to the skepticism about meaning. So if it's taken so seriously, would it really undermine that standard philosophical response?
No. Well, no, I think that could be paraphrased satisfactorily. And a lot of these idiomatic uses of the word can be, and certainly I use the word meaning often enough in a non-technical way myself, and could quite imagine somehow inhibiting that.
We can just review this little section of discussion. Many people are going to want, I imagine, to reject skepticism about meaning, but since you've given these arguments, of course, they have to reject one or other of the starting points, one or other of the premises or assumptions. Are you able to isolate for us perhaps the 2 or 3 really key assumptions that are playing a pivotal role in these arguments that somebody would have to deny in order to deny your conclusion?
Oh, good. Yeah, so you'd have to deny that you'd have to say there's something, analyticity, some things are analytic, some things are knowable by experience, some things are true in virtue of meaning, that there are things called meanings. Do you have to deny the holism? I don't think so. I don't know. And I'm not really saying like what I want my response to need. I'm just kind of going through the video, reacting to it, and trying to say what they're saying here for people who might not know the lingo or whatever. But maybe later I'll have to do something of saying how you can answer these things if you can. Some people think you can't. I sort of think you can. But anyway, all right. So this is getting lengthy already. Let's wrap this up. Let's see what he's going to say. So
Yes, perhaps the principal one is just assumption. Well, I'd say the observation, but one that tends to be neglected is that we learn language only through hearing it and in observable situations. It's a matter of observable behavior. It's the way language is handed down. It's also the way it's used. Language is said to be used in communicating meaning, communicating ideas. How do we know that a given sentence conveys the same meaning to me that the speaker had in mind. The only way we know is by considering the context and considering whether whether his use of the word fits in with the way we might have used the word. It's the observable manifestation. It's the sentence, not the thought, not the meaning, that we have to go on early and late.
He low-key likes to say early and late a lot.
I think the moral of it is, all right, that's all we have to go on. Why don't we stop with that and recognize that that's what we're talking about. We're talking about these sentences and their use and in what circumstances. And it's what the lexicographer also is doing. In fact, if you think about how a dictionary actually runs, it's very seldom that, well, I think it's less than equally often anyway, that you find an out-and-out literal definition, an ostensible equivalent phrase to the word that's being explained. Look up elephant, look at, well...
No, you can find an example of how it's used in some general statements.
Loxodont indicus or whatever. Yes, that's not much help. But then you get descriptions. And the dictionary, the purpose of a dictionary, as I see it early and late, is to give you enough information about a word so that you'll be helped sufficiently in your reading or in your use of it. That there's no boundary between the dictionary and encyclopedia except in terms of that purpose. That the dictionary doesn't, the lexicographer doesn't deliberately go beyond that purpose in the...
boundary, because the encyclopedia gives you like information that's like empirical. And the dictionary is supposed to give you the meaning, so that's sort of his way of saying no distinction between the definitions and knowing facts about the world. Interesting.
Factual information that he's conveying.
So just to sum up about the possible rejection of the meaning skepticism, the best way, from what you've just said, would be to reject the idea that all that the child learning or acquiring language has to go on is the behavior of the surrounding conspecifics.
Yes, and then what is the alternative? There's telepathy. There's somehow innate command of the language, but that's refuted when we start observing the infant and finding that, twins are separated at birth and put into different languages, different households linguistically, come up fluently in the two languages and not in their respective languages, and completely helpless in the other language.
All right, yeah, I think you can answer that with like Chomsky kind of considerations, but I'm noticing this is getting long. I'm going to have to end it here, but that was fun. So let me know if I should do the rest of this video, if you guys want to see it or not, and if so, I'll do it. If not, I'll watch it on my own. What else should I check out with you guys? You want to watch? Have me watch with you guys.